This isn't really near Arcata, but it's on the way, and the story just came to me a minute ago. I grew up in a small town in Maine near Bowdoin College, and about 2 years ago, I was dating a guy from Bowdoin, the town, not the college, who graduated from the same high school as I did. He was a couple years older than I, and had spent a few years in the army, traveling to such exotic places as Korea. I've traveled a few places myself, and being open to new places and experiences, never thought of myself as shy or easily frightened by much of anything. One evening, the man I was seeing, Tim, and I decided we would head out into the woods to one of the numerous secluded areas in Bowdoin where we could spend some quality time doing such things as talking and other nonsense that lovers do. This particular night, we had driven up to an old quarry and it was overcast so that when the truck was parked and the lights were turned off, the world around us was inky black. I had trouble making out the trees that I knew were just beyond the window of the truck. Nights that dark always make one a little weary, and there is something almost natural and primal about being in the woods so deep you cannot see nor hear anything but silence. Like I said, I'm not shy, and on this night, I was feeling adventurous and I wanted to get out of the truck. So, out of the truck I went and into the bed of the truck. Tim followed suit. We laid there on a blanket for a long while when we heard a loud thump on the hood of the truck. I thought a branch had fallen onto the hood, but it was enough to startle us both into getting a flashlight from the inside of the truck. We looked on the hood, nothing. We looked around the truck, nothing but normal leaves and trail. No branches large enough to make the sound we heard. The flashlight was one of those halogen beams that is about 10 times brighter than a normal flashlight, but the darkness was eating up all the light, with the exception of the beam from the bulb. Usually, there's a wide area those lights will cover. This time, however, the light seemed to be overwhelmed by the darkness around us. Feeling a bit on edge, I decided to get back into the truck, but didn't want to leave the woods. As we sat there talking, we got more and more comfortable, and then something slammed into the side of the truck, hard enough to make it rock on the shocks. To me, it sounded and felt like it hit my side, just behind the door. I felt suddenly uneasy. I thought at first that a tree had fallen on us. Tim turned on the truck lights and got out of the truck to look around. I stayed in the truck and watched as he walked around the truck, looking at the ground and at the side of the truck. He signaled for me to get out. I did so. Where I thought the tree had fallen, there was a mudgy smudge on the side of his truck, but not tree, nothing on the ground or around us that would have caused what we just experienced. He asked if I wanted to go, and at that time, I felt so strongly like we should leave, but my curiosity was getting the better of me, and I wanted to stay and see what would happen next. We got back in the truck and sat there, anticipating. Tim turned off all the lights and cracked some jokes about privacy in the deep woods. The longer we sat there, the more uneasy I got, till I felt like I was nearly terrified for no reason. I wanted to leave. Tim, obviously feeling the same way, started the truck and we sped out of the woods at tire-blowing speeds till we saw the lights of the houses. We went into Brunswick and got out to look at the truck again, and where that smudge had been before, now the truck was untouched, like nothing had happened. We never saw what hit the truck or experienced anything like that again. Nothing else unusual happened when we were together, with the exception of one other time when we were at his mother's house, but that's another story. Thank you for reading. I took down my memories from an incident about 8 years ago. Definitely a true story. The other girls that I was with at the time may have not put as much stake in the paranormal, but parts of this experience were too odd to be all coincidental. I hope you enjoy. While this experience happened a number of years ago and has not had any direct bearing on my life, I find it interesting nevertheless. I grew up mostly in Western Connecticut, and though my family moved around a lot in my teens, I attended summer camp every year in Cornwall, Connecticut. In total, I attended or worked at the camp for 8 summers, and in the last 3 years I worked there. During the 6th summer, I was 15 or 16 at the time. I had a strange experience with the other girls I was a CIT with. By the way, It means counselor in training. And while we were hiking outside at night. Hiking outside at night? What made you think that was a good idea, you might ask. But rest assured, there was a good reason. One class held every week culminated in an overnight camping trip, and one of our friends was supervising the overnight. We decided that since she was going to be sitting out alone in the middle of the woods, making sure all the girls actually went to bed, she might benefit from some company, and about 5 or 6 of us headed out with flashlights to find the campsite. Just to clarify, this camp is by no means large. It sits on one side of a commercial ski mountain on a large lake. The campsite our friend was at was alongside a wooded path at the far side of the camp's boundaries, a lovely walk during the day. But a couple of my friends were really timid and nervous about walking around at night, even though we all had attended the camp for years, and years obviously grown used to being in the dark alone. It wasn't a frightening place, other than the darkness and raccoons. We started out on our walk between 9:30 and 10 p.m., followed the wooded path out to a wide gravel road that led to another boat launch site, and remembered that our friend had told us not to go towards the lake, off to the right. The site wasn't far off from that turnoff. None of us had actually ever been to the site itself, and were a little on edge as we started walking away from the water, up the wide, gravel-covered road, because there were lots of animal noises around us, and it was dark, like the deep woods gets at night in summertime. There really was no reason for any of us to actually feel afraid, because the wildlife was more or less accustomed to people and stayed scarce when people were around. Also, we were on a road, not lost in the middle of the woods. We kept walking for what seemed like a relatively short time, but didn't see any sign of a campsite. When someone would suggest we turn back, another person would suggest that we walk just a little further, and I remember feeling inclined to keep walking, because the campsite might just be a little further up the road. We had started walking uphill significantly, and eventually, someone gave an ultimatum, saying we'd be out for more than an hour, walking, and she was scared to walk any further. I was skeptical, even though I too had begun to feel somewhat uneasy. We turned around. I had an odd feeling though the whole walk back that I shouldn't turn around, which probably spooked me more than anything else. We nearly missed our turn back to camp, and when we made it back to the camp center, we found the camp director and several maintenance workers looking panic-stricken. They told us it was past midnight, and our friend, who had been out on the overnight, had brought her campers back less than an hour earlier when she found out there was going to be a powerful thunderstorm hitting. She hadn't known where we were, knew we had planned to come visit her, and went straight to the director so we could be found. We explained what happened, how we couldn't find the campsite, how we kept walking, hadn't any inclination that we'd been out for as long as we had, and our friend looked confused. It wasn't possible, she explained, that we couldn't have seen her campsite. They had camped at a small site, right off of the little wooded path we'd first walked down, and had built up a large fire that was easily visible from the path for some ways in either direction. We shrugged it off as just a strange experience, but when you add everything up, the explanation that we just missed seeing you, kept going, turned off, and walked up a gravel road for a couple miles never sit quite right with me. I didn't learn the strangest part of the story until a couple of years ago. There's a small town located within an uninhabited portion of Cornwall in Cornwall Bridge, Connecticut, called either Dudleytown or Dudleyville, depending on the account. The ghost town, so to speak, is called one of the most haunted places in the country, with a long history of inhabitant mental illness, disappearances, murder, ghost sightings, etc. Some of the most poignant stories of the strange going-ons of Dudleytown have been recently documented spirit sightings, orbs, mechanical failure, cold spots, and the most startling discovery for me was the knowledge that Dudleytown was just located a few miles away from my camp, and, according to my map's readings, further along up the road we had walked on that night and down another turnoff. I've wondered why was it that we kept on walking that night, even though a couple of people were very scared, why I felt like we should just keep walking, why we missed seeing that plainly visible fire, why I felt I couldn't turn back and look behind me, and if we just continued walking along that road, what would have happened if the storm had hit while we were out? Thanks for reading. This happened 2 years ago in Hilton Head, South Carolina. My cousins and myself go on vacation every year. My cousin Daniel and I are best friends and usually stay together all the time. We got to share a room that year. My parents and my aunt and uncle had rented a house on Hilton Head Island, South Carolina that summer for a 2-week vacation. The house was huge, with more rooms in the main floor than my house has on all of the floors. My cousin Daniel and I ran through the house and picked out the coolest room in the house. The room was strange, I must admit. The far corners were made of glass, so you could see into the woods out back. I settled into my room immediately, so my other cousins couldn't take the room. My cousin Daniel left the room to get his bags, just as I finished. It had been a long day, and it was getting dark. I laid down on the bed I chose, and before I knew what happened, I fell asleep. I woke from my sleep at exactly 3:20 in the morning because my cousin, being a chunky person, turned up the air conditioning in the room. So, instead of waking him up by turning down the air and hearing him complain all night, I decided to find somewhere else to sleep only for the night. I wandered the house until I made my way outside in the back of the house. The back of the house had a deck that was in disrepair. I got many splinters in my feet from shuffling outside. The back of the house, after the deck, makes its way into deep woods. However, there was a hammock on the deck that I found comfortable enough to sleep in. I was soon torn from my sleep by a bright light in the woods. I was shocked at first, but when my eyes adjusted to the light, I saw a bright boy emerging from the woods. The boy was 20 feet away at first, but I blinked, and he was less than 5 feet away. He had blonde hair, blue eyes, and a huge scar running from his right ear to his lips. I was so scared that I tried to jump from my hammock, but fell out instead, scraping my face on the deck. I woke up the next morning in my bed. I thought it was all a dream, but when I looked in the mirror and saw the scratches from the deck on my face, I never went in the back of the house again. Thanks for reading. There have been some stories here recently about roads that appeared or disappeared or led to strange places or turned into something that was unexpected. This story is about how we almost lost some people on a trail that ended in a meadow that could not possibly have been there. I was not there when this supposedly happened, so I cannot guarantee its truth. Later investigation showed absolutely nothing. That happened long ago, and I do not necessarily remember all the details now, but at least I think that I have the story pretty much right. In a remote mountain camp that I used to frequent, a trail led down the river a short distance, I think about a mile or so, to Rotary Gospel Camp. Both our camp and the Rotary Gospel Camp, and the river between them, were in a narrow canyon with high ridges on both sides and no side canyons. Several of us had been down that canyon, also up and over the ridges on both sides, and we knew that there was no way to leave that canyon without knowing it. Although the terrain was steep, hiking was easy along the trail, and that route was considered quite safe for youth day hikes. Generally, it is hard to become lost when following a river downstream, but when following a river upstream, in some cases, there is a possibility of becoming lost by accidentally following a tributary rather than the main stream. In this case though, in that deep narrow canyon, all that they had to do was hike back up the canyon to our camp, and in an emergency, they could have gone into the Rotary Gospel Camp and used their telephone, so we considered it a safe hike. One afternoon, 2 adults from our camp, with several youth members ranging in age from maybe 11 years to about 15 years, hiked down the trail towards the Rotary Gospel Camp, intending to turn back at the edge of that camp and return to our camp well before dinner. The adults and some of the youth members knew the trail well. In that narrow canyon, over the short distance to the Rotary Gospel Camp, and with several people who knew the trail, a map and compass seemed unnecessary. Several people had wristwatches, the mechanical, wind-up kind. Modern quartz crystal watches were non-existent in those days. One person had a pen light, and one youth member had a camera. This is their story as I remember it. Some distance down the trail, when they expected soon to reach the Rotary Gospel Camp, The canyon widened into a huge meadow that nobody recognized. Nearby, at one edge of the meadow, beside the trees, there was a log cabin, but no people were visible. The meadow seemed much too wide to fit in that narrow canyon. There was no possibility that the group had passed the Rotary Gospel Camp, as it was in the bottom of the canyon, just like our own camp. Although they knew that something was wrong, they followed the river into the meadow, alert for any tributary streams that might confuse them when they retracted their route. After a while, they noticed that the river had decreased greatly in size and flow. That alarmed them, and they turned around and headed back up the river. Even as they followed the river upstream in the meadow, the river rapidly disappeared. There were no dams on that river, and no recent weather patterns to account for such a sudden decrease in the flow. They followed the sandy river channel back upstream through the meadow, but soon, even the channel disappeared, leaving the group in that big flat meadow with only the mountain ridges for landmarks, and even those ridges seemed to be too much far apart. From the group's position within the meadow, they could not even see the canyon where the river had entered the meadow. Since they did not have a compass, one of the adults used the sun as an indicator of azimuth to keep them headed back towards our camp. But as they took frequent note of the sun's position, they noticed that it was setting much too fast, even though their watches indicated that the time still was early afternoon. At that time of the year, the middle of June, at that location, the sun sets very late. Fortunately, they had not gone far too into the meadow before they turned back. They reached the edge of the meadow just about when the sun set, and there, they suddenly came upon the canyon that they had hiked down. It had been hidden from their view, or maybe it was not even there, while they were in the meadow. The river was flowing normally in the canyon, and it sank into the ground where it entered the meadow. When the group started up the river, they immediately recognized familiar landmarks, to their enormous relief. In that deep and heavily forested canyon, soon it was so dark that they could barely even see where they were going, even though it was still early afternoon according to their watches. With their one little pen light, they stumbled over the rocks, expecting to find the smooth trail that ran beside the river, but apparently they missed a trail in the darkness. Rather than spend the night there, they decided to continue the short distance up the river to our camp. As they explained later, after having the canyon and the river disappear right out from under them and becoming lost in the meadow and having night come in the early afternoon, they were so shaken that they wanted to return to civilization right then. They no longer even were sure that our camp was still there, or even that morning would come, and they did not want to spend an eternity in a canyon that maybe went from one non-existent meadow to nowhere. So, they continued stumbling over the rocks, even after the little penlight's batteries were exhausted. Hiking on a smooth trail is easy in the daytime. Even hiking over rocks in the river is not too bad when you see where you are going. But it took them hours to go probably less than a mile up the river to our camp. Some of them were badly bruised from falling over the rocks, but fortunately, nobody was injured seriously. They were enormously relieved to reach our camp buildings and our camp's own little meadow. They headed straight for our group's campsite. I had been out of the camp that afternoon. Otherwise, probably, I would have gone with them on that hike. When I returned to the camp that evening, the decision already had been made not to start searching for them until morning. The camp director already had telephoned to the Rotary Gospel Camp and had determined that our group had not been seen there. When they returned, I was almost as relieved as they were. We all stayed up late into the night with the camp director, going over their story. None of us found any significant discrepancies between their accounts. Their watches all indicated late afternoon. At first, they were not hungry. To them, it was not yet dinner time. Apparently, at least in that meadow, time had affected their environment at one rate and had affected both them and their watches much more slowly. Or maybe they still were too shaken to be hungry. Partway through the discussion, the camp director served them dinner, and we finished discussion as they ate. The next day, we had everybody who had been on the hike write their accounts on paper with no further prompting and with no discussion between them as they wrote. After they finished writing, we asked them to add their recollections of various details, again with no discussion as they wrote. I remember asking them to record details of the transition between the canyon and the meadow, and of the riverbed in the meadow, also about where the sun set over the ridges above the meadow. I do not remember now what details the other adults requested. That process went right through lunch, and they ate with one hand while writing with the other hand. No, we were not slave drivers. Those people seemed as anxious to record that incident as we were to have it recorded. Then, we turned the youth members loose, along with the two adults who had been on the hike, and the camp director and I stayed late into the evening comparing the written accounts. There too, we found no significant discrepancies. To the great regret of all of us, the people had been so shaken that the person with the camera had not thought to take the pictures of the meadow. Probably still is kicking himself for that. Or maybe it is just as well that he did not take pictures. Just possibly, recording that scene might somehow have trapped them there permanently. Of course, that is pure speculation. Wild speculation at that. The following morning, the camp director, the two adults who had been on the hike, and I started down the river for another look. This time, we took maps and compasses, watches, cameras, flashlights with spare batteries and bulbs, and notepaper. I took a roll of brightly colored plastic tape for temporarily marking our route, both so that we could find our way back in case of difficulty, and, to be truthful, that just in case we did not return, other people could follow our route. On general principles, we took lunches. Portable two-way radios were not common in those days, otherwise, we would have wanted them. I took a small portable instrument for measuring the sun's elevation angle for any location and time of day. It is easier to compute the sun's azimuth and elevation angle. Also, if you measure the sun's elevation angle at two known and widely separated times during a day, then, in principle, you can compute your location, latitude and longitude. That is a standard procedure in celestial navigation. If we came to the meadow again, then I would compare the sun's azimuth with the magnetic compass and measure the sun's elevation angle at frequent intervals according to our watches. Then, back home, assuming that we survived the trip, I would try to make sense out of any strange behavior such as the group had observed 2 days previously. I also took a telephone in Linman's test set. That is a little self-contained telephone like you see on linemen's tool belts, except that test set had miniature rotary dials in those days, rather than modern push buttons. Our camp's telephone line ran beside the river to the Rotary Gospel Camp, where the telephone cable ended. Along the river between the two camps, our telephone line was attached to trees at about head height, so we could be able to use it in case of emergency. I admit to some concern that if we did find the meadow, then the telephone line might neither cross the meadow nor go around it, and thus we might be isolated. In our camp, I'd asked the hikers whether they had noticed whether the telephone line crossed the meadow, but none of them had noticed the line even in the canyon. As I look back on it now, we were asking for trouble. Maybe we should have had more backup before we started investigating. Before we left our camp, I found an excuse to telephone one of my friends at the Rotary Gospel Camp, and I arranged to meet him there. From our camp director's call 2 days previously, my friend already knew that something was wrong. I begged off explaining until we met personally. Now, after all that build-up, here comes the most embarrassing part of my story. We walked down the trail to the Rotary Gospel Camp and saw absolutely nothing unusual. On the way, I tied strips of surveyor's flagging to 3 branches at frequent intervals. I also kept a close watch on our telephone line beside the river. It was there, right where it was supposed to be. There was no meadow. The river still was very much there, in the bottom of the narrow canyon. The sun was rising slowly in the sky, just like it should be doing at that time of day. We went into the Rotary Gospel Camp, and we met our friends there. As my excuse for being there, I looked at some equipment that I had helped them to build, but probably they still are wondering why we went there that day. Our camp director used their telephone to call back to our camp to let our people know that we had made it safely that far. Then we took our leave and walked back up the trail to our camp, removing the strips of surveyor's flagging as we went. We ate our lunches in the camp dining room with the rest of the camp members. We felt relieved and also a little bit foolish, but we would rather feel foolish than be lost. These mountains have changed drastically during geologic time. The river systems have reformed so extensively that it is hard to imagine how much different they used to be. But all of that happened long before there were people on Earth. Thus, even if our group somehow was transferred back in time to another geological area, which I still find impossible to believe, that does not explain the log cabin in the meadow. What was that meadow all about? And the disappearing river? And the rapidly setting sun? Darned if I know. If that group made up their story, then they did have a very good job of doing it, telling it, and writing it with no significant discrepancies. If they used a hike as an excuse for some mysterious detour, then they had one heck of a climb out of the canyon to get there. I think that all of us were basically honest, except of course, for the standard campers' practice of telling outrageous lies around campfires. My guess is that the hitchhikers were just as puzzled as I was, and also were thankful to be alive after it was all over. That was a long time ago, and I've lost contact with all these people now. Hey guys, it's Phantom of Darkness here, and I just wanted to say, yeah, that last one was a really long story, but I know I heard some people wanted some outdoorsy, type woodsy forest stories to tell, so without further ado, I gave you those narrations of foresty, woodsy, outdoorsy type stories. I guess they're kind of interesting. But really, leave a like, share, comment, and subscribe, because this phantom has feet just like any other human. Just because I'm a ghost doesn't mean I have feet, because I do. Just ignore what I'm just saying. I don't even make any sense. Alright guys, good night, good morning, and I'll see you in the next video.